Welcome to my channel and my very first YouTube video. My name is Sam Drucker, the writer behind the miniatures game about mass protest, People's State. In this video, I will provide an overview of the game and rules with a sample game turn at the end. If you have any questions or would like further clarification, please ask in the comments. As an independent solo rules writer, I've always been fascinated by connecting the concepts of social physics and human behavior into miniatures games. People's State is my latest result of that exploration. It is a miniatures game about mass protests where one player acts as law enforcement, trying to maintain order and minimize the presence of crowds in a public right-of-way, and the other player acting as the protest crowd, taking on the mass of people seeking to promote a message and to establish a presence within a physical location on the table. I didn't design this game as any sort of political statement or even to recreate specific events. I made it as a strategic simulation of the mechanical systems involved in public order. It is an abstract look at the dynamics on the street, where the primary objective isn't about the destruction of an opponent, but rather the management of a tense environment through a strategic lens. Far too often there are games about mass protests that really focus on rioting and the riot behaviors, with inflicting injury and destruction as the primary goals. I just wanted to create a game within the hobby I love that explores the topic of mass protest with a bit more nuance and fairness in how the sides are depicted. A typical game takes place on a 4-foot by 4-foot or 4-foot by 6-foot table for a 2-player game. Generally, multiplayer games should have even numbers of players on both sides. The table should have dense urban terrain with plenty of scatter in the form of street furniture and parked vehicles. In People's State, conflict centers on two asymmetrical forces: law enforcement and the protester crowd. The law enforcement player is tasked with the job of restoring order, specifically by reducing the strength of the protesting crowd. Conversely, the protester player focuses on positioning, aiming to keep most of the crowd numbers within a designated protest point location. It is a contest of spatial control and endurance, where the protester's cluster strength represents the collective resolve and numbers of a group, and the LE's discipline, representing the professional coordination required to hold a line under pressure. A protester crowd starts as a single mass of bases, moving as an amorphous blob through the streets, while actions are taken either by a single base or the crowd as a whole. A certain action allows for the splitting of this crowd, but game conditions need to reach a certain point to allow that action. LE, on the other hand, operate as individual units as built by the player. They move independently and carry out actions separately or as a force. Protester bases, or clusters, have a strength value. As this number gets reduced through LE actions, it represents the loss of resolve by people running away or retreating from the situation. This can be healed through actions, as crowds can regain numbers as more people join the cause. On the other hand, LE units do not have a health tracking system. Each unit has a respective discipline rating, where the only dice rolls in the game are played to determine if a unit must do a forced retreat. This makes them move to the nearest LE vehicle or even back to their deployment zone. They are never removed from play. At the heart of this simulation is the interaction between two critical metrics: tension and optics. The tension track represents the boiling point of the crowd and the city. As it rises through 3 distinct tiers, it unlocks more powerful actions from both sides, ranging from simple lawful orders and chanting to the deployment of tear gas and high-impact choices. However, as tension escalates, so does the risk. One way this risk is employed is by changes on the optics track. Optics is the public perception of the conflict. High-impact actions might diminish protester numbers, but if they are perceived as excessive or unnecessary, the public cost can lead to a narrative failure. This balance creates some moral ambiguity and may force the player to weigh their options to minimize their risk. In this game, high optics is seen as solidarity in the protester's cause, while low optics is seen as defense in the law enforcement's actions. A crucial element of the behavior of those involved is the press. Press teams, neutral non-playable elements, are placed across the board, providing an effective radius of coverage and acting as an observer. If an escalation occurs within sight of these cameras, tension may be amplified. and if a player has units within range at the end of a turn, they may gain an optics bonus. This creates a unique layer where the players must decide not only what action to take, but where they should take it. An unavoidable topic in protests are the illegal acts and vandalism that occur. I've tried to make it abundantly clear that the purpose of most protests, and the ones depicted through my game, is not to destroy property or to harm people. Regardless, rogue actors will presumably carry out these actions. Instead of ignoring reality, I incorporated a mechanic called flashpoints. These are tokens placed at the start of the game by both players. If any unit moves within 3 inches of one during play, they must reveal the event. This is done by drawing a playing card and checking against the table. Depending on the current tension level, an event will occur. This can be anything from a loud bang from fireworks to a dumpster set on fire to a gathering of counter-protesters, all of which influence units in play or those nearby the flashpoint. Next, I will cover how a full turn in People's State works, taking place mid-game.
Taking just over halfway through a typical 2-player game, we start with the initiative phase, where the first player is determined every turn. In this example, tension is at level 6 within Tier 2. This allows all players access to any action Tier 2 or lower. Additionally, optics is at level 4. So as we start with the initiative phase, both players will roll 1d6 to determine the higher number, which will go first for the turn. In this case, we'll do red for the protesters, blue for the law enforcement team. Looks like blue wins, so law enforcement will go first. And before we get to the actual action of the player phase, we need to remove the press teams for the initiative phase. And in this case, we have them positioned from a previous turn in the middle in the open here. Doesn't matter how they're removed, just take them off the table at this point, and they will be replaced in the next phase, which is the press phase. With initiative, in this case, LE takes control of the press report, which determines coverage and press team placement for the upcoming turn. Coverage is dictated by the current optics and tension levels, as shown by these charts. On the top, we have the coverage section, which relies solely on the optics level and tension level currently. And in this case, we're at optics of 4 and tension of 6. So that puts us squarely in the neutral area. What this does is provides an influence over the tabletop for the player's abilities in terms of press teams. So for press, if it's neutral, it doubles the range, the effective range of the press teams, both the live streamer on the single base and then the field reporter on the 40mm multi-base. Following coverage, we have press team placement. This is done through a card draw. And it kind of, if you look there, if you can read that, it dictates where on the table the press teams are placed, what proximity they're within. So by having initiative, it's ideal to have control over where these press teams go. They each have their own effect, and it's part of their strategy to place the team where it will impact players the most. They do have a deficit when certain actions are committed near them, so you might want to place them near your opponent's forces if possible, or to inhibit them in some way. But at the end of the turn, when it's time to consider victory conditions, during the optics phase, it helps sway the optics level by 1 if your unit is within the closest proximity to a press team. I'll explain that later in this turn. All right, here we draw the card. We have a jack of clubs, and that means the field reporter gets placed within 8 inches of any protest cluster. So we'll go ahead, take the field reporter base, And within 8 inches, simply place. And then for the Jack of Clubs, we have Live Streamer. They are within 8 inches of an LE staging area. So in this table, this 4 foot by 4 foot table I'm using, this Bearcat is marking the edge of table where the law enforcement had deployed. And so it's kind of just an indicator. It provides no real game effect by being there. So we'll just move that out of the way and place a live streamer. This it seemingly has no effect for this turn, but if an action during the game causes a player or the law enforcement player to do a forced retreat, they would have to move back to their deployment zone in order to rejoin the protest. So we'll see if that happens. The press phase is complete. We move on to the player phase. Player phase is broken down into 2 sub-phases, if you will. First being movement, the second being actions. The LE player will move all their units first, as they so choose. They can move up to 6 inches, each unit, that is. And then following the LE movement being completed, the protest player will then move. And then the LE player will commit their actions, and the protesters will follow. I've just moved the LE player up there, up to 6 inches. You'll notice the red token there. That is a flashpoint. When either force or any unit gets within 3 inches, they must reveal the token. By reveal, I mean token. A card is drawn in place of the token, and that will dictate what flashpoint occurs, what event occurs either in that place or however it's dictated. It could be along the street, it could be specifically at that point, but we'll see. And it might be the protesters that reveal it first. Something I'll note while I move the protester crowd is how a protester crowd behaves. It's a bit of a key point that a protester's crowd behaves as essentially one unit of multiple bases. There is an action to split the crowd and subdivide the group, but when moving as one, they need to maintain 3 inches of cohesion between bases at least, or at most, I should say, but they can move however they need to. So say a a base needs to go through a tighter space, they're technically still within cohesion of the group. Or if a vehicle breaks up their formation, so long as it's 3 inches between a base to the next base, then it's legal. But as you see now, the flashpoint has now been activated, and we'll check the chart to see what comes up. Here we have the flashpoint chart, and knowing that we're at tier 2 because we are tension level 6 at the moment, we need to draw another card and see what rank it is in order to determine which flashpoint occurs. So we have a king. So right now we have command hesitation, and the nearest LE unit suffers hesitant. It's important to note in this game that a lot of the in-game effects from actions and other events and occurrences are delved out by condition keywords. Because there aren't any traditional hit points and wounds in this game, conditions cover the bases of mental and physical inhibitions and effects that would cause a player to prevent them from doing certain actions. So in this case, hesitant means that for the next player phase for that unit, in this case, nearest LE unit, they can only perform tier 1 actions. They're restricted to tier 1 regardless of what the actual tier level is of the game. So in this case, we're going to say that this LE unit is the closest to the flashpoint, and they suffer the hesitant condition. At the same time, we remove the token. Once it's revealed and used, it is eliminated from the board. Keep in mind that also that there are going to be multiple of them throughout the board at the start of the game, placed alternatingly by the players involved. With movement complete, we move on to actions. And at this point, it'll be the LE actions going first. LE units have 3 actions to utilize amongst their entire force, 1 per unit. There is 1 action per side in which multiple units can actually participate in, but they still only count as 1 action being used of the 3. But the participating units can't use another action that turn. So, for example, the law enforcement has an action called Form Line. It's a Tier 1 action, but multiple bases can participate. And I will just run through the example, although I will not be choosing this action for this turn. So if, say, these 3 units wanted to form line, which basically gives them a sort of a defensive bonus, but restricts them in movement, they would move up to a certain distance to form the line. This is in addition to their previous movement. And they are then obligated and committed to that action. So it's 1 action, I still have 2 left, but these 3 units cannot use another action this turn. So I would divvy up the other 2 actions between the other 2 bases involved. But I choose not to do that action right now. Instead, I'll choose to do Intimidation. Intimidation is a Tier 2 action, and LE units would strike their shield with a baton, sort of banging on it as a show of authority. So the 2 nearest clusters in range are affected by that show of authority. And in this case, we have the 2 nearest. Well, I will choose this LE base to do Intimidation. And so that would mean, you can see clusters A and B are the nearest in line of sight, not being blocked by building or street furniture up over 2 inches tall. And what Intimidation does, more specifically, is gives them each -2 strength, and it gives them the hesitant condition. As I mentioned, hesitant meaning they can only choose Tier 1 actions next turn. But this means that A and B get an additional, just mark them with these rings for now, an extra 2 strength. You'll notice cluster A there already had 1 on, so now they're at -3 strength. Each cluster has 8 strength total. If they are at 3 or below, they are then shaken, minimizing what they can do, but they will tag along with their crowd. And then once they reach 0, they're dispersed and cannot come back. And that's really the LE's goal here, is to disperse the crowd up at least down to 50% of their starting numbers, and preventing them from getting into the protest point, which I'll point out right now is 6 inches from this government building, where I'm marked with these cones. And if once they get inside, they need to be there at the 6th turn or later to achieve their goal. But for now, they've just divvied out quite a hit on those clusters. And something of note here is that this action, this Tier 2 action, was committed in range of the field reporter. What the field reporter does is, if Tier 2 or Tier 3 actions are committed in range of them, which is 8 inches, then that increases tension by 1 automatically. Some actions already increase tension by virtue of how they behave. And in this case, Intimidation was already a +1 tension, and because it was committed near the field reporter, it's an extra +1 tension. This will increase our tension level from a level 6 twice up to level 8, which is a tier 3. So at this point, automatically, all actions available to either player is unlocked up to tier 3. So as you know, the LE player has only committed one action so far. If they choose, they can do a tier 3 action on their next as their next one. Because we're now at hitting tier 3, this is where a unique game mechanic comes into play, and the National Guard is now deployed. Now, the person who committed the action to increase tension up to tier 3 will get to place a base of National Guardsmen within 4 inches of a public building. Now, in any game, the objective, the protest point, isn't necessarily a public building, but it can be. That's up to the player to decide. It just so happens in this case, I made it that way for this example. And so we'll put it within 4 inches of the public building to act as a buffer. So National Guard essentially makes it so that any unit can't go within 4 inches of that building. Any protester cluster starting its player phase within 6 inches of the National Guard unit gains hesitant, which is coming up quite a bit here, but it's a common one. If an LE unit is within 3 inches, they gain anchored, which, but if the same unit commits a high impact action, the optics shifts +1, which is in the favor of the protesters. These little nuances are key to how a player will choose to commit actions in certain places around certain people. Now we're going to do the LE's second action, which they will choose to do a tear gas action, which is tier 3, now previously unlocked by the last action. And in this case, a unit in range of their target point, in this case, we'll choose this unit, and they will choose to pinpoint a, we'll say it, but this template is going to show that it's within range. If they were to say, choose this point for this action to be targeting, what you do is, automatically, this is the point where it will originate from, but what you do is roll a scatter die, and that will dictate which direction the tear gas will be blowing. So theoretically, they could blow back on the LE, which will have an effect. It will force them to move back. Or if it hits the clusters, it could have a sort of a widespread effect as well. So we'll go ahead and roll a scatter die. And we're going to go off of the dark arrow on this to dictate that it blows straight back across multiple clusters. So now each of these clusters is gassed, which means that it's -2 strength for all those involved. That's pretty hard hitting in this case, and that forces the entire crowd to move back 2 inches. And if, let's just say, for example, that an LE unit was affected by this, they are moved back just half a move. So in this case, 3 inches, they would have to essentially retreat a little bit. And now, because it's quite dangerously close to the field reporter, once again, that will increase tension by 1. So right now, I'll go ahead and start placing 2 strength hits on each one of these affected units. Now we have cluster A is definitely shaken at this point. They are at 3 remaining, that is. Well, the other clusters are still fine, but they are quite affected by the gassed. We'll leave it there for now. So for the third action, LE is going to mix it up a little bit and do something a little less impactful. They'll do a tier 1 action called Lawful Order, one of my favorite ones. Automatically, it's -1 optics, and within 8 inches of range, one LE unit targets a crowd within line of sight. They must choose to either gain driven back and -1 tension, or they must accept +1 tension and -2 strength for the nearest cluster. So in this case, they are going to give the lawful order, this unit will give a lawful order to B. That is within 8 inches. Actions can be committed freely through or over fellow friendly units. And in this case, works perfectly fine here. And so it's up to the protester player to choose which to accept. Do they want the lessened tension but suffer driven back? Or do they accept extra attention and less strength just so they don't have to be driven back? Driven back would force them to move, obviously, away from the LE player given the terrain constraints. That's a good question. So the protester player is going to choose to accept extra tension and the hits to the strength. And I think that might not be, maybe that's not the best choice, but they're going for it. So now they're down to half. They're still fine, not shaken. And the optics will also go -1. And because of the lawful order action, it's a -1 optics, so that drops optics down to level 2, which is now within LE favor. But as I mentioned, this is mid-game. This is not at the end of the game yet. There's still plenty of opportunity for optics to shift back up or back down. Meanwhile, because they decline the lawful order, the tension will shift up 1, which in our case is really bringing us to the max level of the chart there. Now that the LE player has completed their 3 actions, it's now the protester's turn to commit their 3 actions. It's important to note that condition effects like hesitant and driven back do not stack. If a player is hit with the same condition multiple times, only the first instance of the condition is carried out. Also, if a condition is inflicted, its effect carries through the next player phase for that affected unit. In this case, several protesters were given hesitant, but this applies for the current protester's actions. Whereas any conditions given to LE this turn will affect them the next player's phase. All right, so we'll get to the actions. Clusters A and B are still hesitant, using only tier 1 actions if they're used at all. Now I can completely avoid using them. They're the ones, if you recall, they're the ones up front here, hit the most hard by the LE's actions. Now I can completely avoid using them if I want to keep using level tier 2 and tier 3 actions. And but we'll see. So for the first action, we'll do mutual aid, which is a tier 2 protester action. And we're going to say cluster H, which is right here, will, let's see, they'll do mutual aid on cluster A. Cluster A has been hit quite hard and is shaken. So what that does is restores 2 strength and forces them to regroup, which means the cluster moves to the rear of the protest crowd opposite of the LE unit. So we're going to just take off 2, restore 2 strength, I should say, and cluster A will just move directly away and towards the back of the group. So they were given aid by their fellow protesters, and we're taking a minute at the rear of the group to collect themselves. Now, because of this, the crowd itself gains constricted, which is minus 2-inch movement. Now, as you have seen, movement is its own phase, and where the bulk of the activity, as far as getting from one A to point B, occurs, but actions themselves have movement ingrained into them, depending on which action it is. So there's still opportunity to get to a place by virtue of some actions. Now we'll move on. That was a tier 2 action and causes tension to rise because of its proximity to the field reporter. But because we're already maxed out at level 10, it does not change. Now for action 2, they choose to they'll choose to chant, tier 1 action. So the protester player is going to make another effort to regain strength. A cluster nearest to cluster A and B is chosen to commit the action. So we will have, let's do cluster D right up here. We'll do the chant action. Chanting is what you think it is. It's the group is trying to get the crowd to speak in a uniform manner. And in this case, the result of that is an automatic -1 tension. So level 10 will go down to level 9. And a +1 strength to clusters within 3 inches of that unit. So in this case, that would easily be I and C here. So they'll get a -1, which is only helpful to their strength. And then that completes the second action. Now for their last action, they're going to choose to do something a little bold. They're going to go for a tier 3 action, an improvised barricade. And to prepare for the next turn, the protester player is going to put up a defensive measure in the form of a physical barrier, makeshift physical barrier, and that'll behave as the same as a piece of furniture, a piece of street furniture, which is a typical terrain type and is present, as you see here. This makes up street furniture. Yeah, it's still traversable, and you can still do actions over it, but it inhibits you by movement and makes any action committed over it cost 2 actions to complete. So now looking at who I should have commit this action, I'm going to choose cluster C in this case. They have yet to carry out an action, but the best they can do is provide this cover in proximity to their base. And if an LE player at this stage, because it's an improvised barricade and not a typical piece of street furniture, the one difference is that an LE player, if they were to commit an action over it, automatically increases tension regardless of what action it is, because they are trying to breach this makeshift barrier. So with the playing of that last action, that completes the player phase. Now, after the player phase is all complete, we move on to the optics phase. In the optics phase, we determine who is closest to either or both press teams. And the force with the units closest to the press teams gain the benefit of an optics shift in their favor by 1. And as stated previously, the LE wants low optics, the protesters want positive optics, high optics. In this example, we have field reporter very close to the protester clusters to their benefit, and the field reporter is, or the live streamer is well out of range of any units. So in this case, the favor goes to the protesters. Now, if there was a multiplayer game with multiple protesters and multiple LE players, then there's a point value associated with the press teams. the field reporter would be worth 2 points, while the live streamer would be worth 1 point. And in multiplayer games, there would be multiple sets of press teams. And so the team that has the most point value press teams in their range, in proximity, will gain that optics benefit. But as far as it stands right now, the protesters gain the perk, shifting optics from a level 2 to a level 3. And the next phase, the final phase of a turn, is checking for victory conditions. Now, this is typically done on turn 6 or after. Like I said, we're mid-game, probably turn 3, maybe 4, and this wouldn't necessarily be bothered to be checked at this point, but I'll go ahead and go over what it consists of. But if it was 6th turn or after, and tension is at level 10 the way it is, this means that the optics would have to shift 1 step to center before checking for victory. It's in the player's best interest to make sure that tension isn't too high whenever they are anticipating the securing of victory, and to play your, no pun intended, to play your cards right as far as planning ahead. In this case, as we said, the optics is in the LE's favor, and they're on track to disperse 50% or more of the protester crowd. But the protesters are quite close to their objective. I think in the next few turns, they'd be able to heal their strength in numbers and put up some defensive options in time. But we'll see if the press teams and the National Guard are going to shake that up. We'll see. But anyways, that is my overview of a basic player turn of a game that's still being ironed out, but will still be released in May of this year. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know if there's anything else that you want to see me talk about, or any questions I can answer. I'm an open book. I'm happy to talk about it and get your feedback. If you want to follow along for any future updates or any new content coming out, check out my Facebook page at Samuel S. Drucker Wargame Author, or here on YouTube. And I recently started a People's State Discord. The links for all this stuff will be in the video description, and we'll see you next time. Thanks again for watching.